Part 7. Finally, Marcus walked up. He didn't even look at Allison. He turned instead to Jonathan and held out his hand. The vampire tried to hide his surprise as he shook it, and they exchanged names. Then Marcus turned to me and hugged me. "I'm glad I finally got to meet you," he stated. "Same here. It was fun," I smiled weakly. I watched the garage door open, and finally my car drove out and pulled up next to his. Jonathan smiled at me. "I'm sorry your father gave you such an early curfew." I shrugged. "It happens. I was just glad he let me come at all." Track rolled down the passenger window, and then Jonathan stepped up and opened the door for me. I thanked him quietly and slid inside. He barely had the door closed, and Track had the car in gear and was making a U-turn. I slumped down in my seat. "We did not invite her," I stated, looking out the window at the faces that watched us past. "I'll make sure they know that," came a tight voice next to me. I sighed and laid my head back against the seat, closing my eyes. Track shifted gears and reached over and put his hand on mine. I squeezed it tightly. "Don't let this ruin all the fun we had tonight, Ray," he stated. I opened my eyes and looked over at him. "I really don't think Allison meant any harm." "I know she didn't," he rolled his shoulders and then added, "I hope you did have a good time, though." "I had a blast," I stated sincerely. "Just hate leaving so early." "Maybe next time your dad will let you stay longer," he shrugged. "Nothing bad happened this time." I chuckled. "True. Just a slight phone fatality." He laughed and nodded. "See? There you have it. So that should leave us clear for a longer visit next time." He let go of my hand to shift and then took it again. He glanced up into the rear view mirror, and I looked at the side one. "Can you stay for a while?" I asked. "I wish I could, but the ceremony." I frowned, but he chuckled. "If I'm going to ask to get part of tomorrow night off." I turned. "Oh, that's right," I smiled. "Do you really think they'll let you come?" "Not sure, but I'll try." He shot me another look. "Do you really want me to come?" "Yes," I nearly shouted. "To protect you from all the T-tops?" "Well, that too," I chuckled, and looked back out the window. "What other reason?" I looked at him and sighed. "Because you're my best friend, Track." He stated, and then took a corner a little harder than he needed to. I put my hand on the door to steady myself and grunted. "Do you guys always have to be squaring off?" "It's what we do, babe," he joked, and I rolled my eyes. When we finally turned down the road that led to the gate, a light blinked on my dash. I reached over and pushed it. "It's just me and Track," I stated, as I held the intercom down. "Jonathan and Allison are in the car behind us." "Yes, Miss Beldrin," came the stiff voice as we saw the gates start to slide open ahead of us. We drove through and headed towards the main garage that was directly connected to the house. Track drove up to the small landing where Ander and Michael were waiting. "Wait," Track stated as I reached for my door. I watched him get out and walk around to my side. He opened my door, and I looked at him hard as he reached in and helped me out. Jonathan and Allison stepped up, and Track ignored them. He went to toss Michael the keys, but I stopped him. "Why don't you keep it tonight? That way you can drive it tomorrow when we go to Beamer's." Track shook his head and finished the throw. "I need to run," he stated, and I nodded. Then he pulled me into his arms, and I leaned against him, not caring that everyone was watching. "Maybe I will come pay you a visit later after all," he whispered directly into my ear. I looked up at him and smiled. Then he let go and took a step back. Allison smiled at him, and he gave her a nod. Then he and Jonathan looked at each other. "I'll take care of her," Jonathan stated, taking a step closer to me. Track chuckled. "Sorry, man. That job's already taken." Then he turned and headed out a side door. After he was gone, I turned and headed into the house, pausing as a howl rang through the air. I smiled and then continued inside. Allison rushed up to my side. "Oh, Reina, I wish we could have gotten there sooner. We got a bit lost at first. We did try to call, but you didn't answer." "Yeah, my phone got a little destroyed," I mumbled. "Oh my," she gasped. "We saw the wolves wrestling and fighting when we drove in. I can't believe they do that right there in their yards." I chuckled. "Why, Allison? It's what they do." Jonathan stepped up. "They are bringing the bags upstairs to my rooms. I'll sort through them and send yours to you." "Bags? As in plural?" "Allison got a bit carried away, I'm afraid," he chuckled. I looked at her and her eyes widened. "Please don't be mad. I just couldn't help myself. I know you'll love the stuff I got you." Then she turned smiling. "But Jonathan was the one that picked out your outfit for tomorrow night." I eyed him and he winked back. "You did promise to wear whatever we picked out." I grimaced. "I did, didn't I?" He nodded and we all headed down the hallway. My father stepped out of a room and then looked me up and down. "I'm going to go take a shower," I stated, putting one hand up. But he grabbed me and hugged me tight, then smiled. "It seems you had a very good time." I grinned, looking up at him. "I had an absolutely incredible time, Dad." My father's eyes twinkled, and he wiped a spot on my forehead and then kissed it. "Well then, that's all that matters." He turned to Jonathan. "It seems I'm going to have to order her a new phone. I wonder if they have one that's werewolf-proof." I shot him a look and he winked. Gads, I could never get really mad at my dad. Jonathan nodded. "I'd be happy to take care of that for you." I frowned as my dad smiled. "I would appreciate that. Nothing too fancy, just very durable." I rolled my eyes and continued to the stairs, with Allison babbling on about the mall and the drive and the mall. Jonathan stopped when we got to my door. "I'll have a new phone for you before we leave tomorrow." "You don't have to do that, you know." He nodded. "I know." I shrugged and looked at Allison. "I really need to take a nice long shower." "Oh," she stated, shifting in place. Obviously she wanted to talk about the fabulous trip to the mall more, but I wasn't in the mood. Jonathan nodded. "I'll go see to the bags. Allison, I'm sure there are a few of yours in there as well." "Right," she bounced, and then the two of them left back down the hallway. I watched them for a second, then slipped into my room. The smile moved back over my face as I replayed the night in Polson. I pulled out fresh clothes and headed towards the bathroom, chuckling and wondering when I could go back again. After the wonderful, long, hot shower, I emerged from my bathroom, the steam swirling out behind me, and groaned. There were at least 8 bags sitting on the floor by my bed, all with the names of mall stores swirled across them. I stood where I was, watching them, as if they might come alive at any moment. Finally, I shook my wet hair, sighed, and headed to the door without bothering to look in any of them. Chapter 5. Michael and Ander walked quietly behind me as I moved down the hall to my sitting room. It was blissfully empty, and I sighed in relief. My bodyguard stayed out in the hallway, and I made my way to the large window on the far end. I ignored the beautiful landscape gardens, the expensive fountain, and the soft flickering lights that illuminated them. My eyes looked to the tree line, and I sighed, feeling an emptiness wash over me. If there was some way to have my 2 worlds melt into one, I would be the happiest vampire on earth. My father had his world, a world of vampires, business, and politics. My wolves had their world, and I was left to toggle between them. My father was the only thing keeping me here. The only thing. I wish I could pack us up and move us to Polson. I didn't care about the money. We could live in a little house like Track's. A blue house, I thought as I touched the window. I had always wanted to live in a blue house. My frown deepened and I sighed. My father would never be happy there. I drew back my shoulders, determined not to have a pity party after such a wonderful night, but my eyes lingered outward. I felt their pull and I wanted to be with them. When I turned, I gasped as Jonathan stood quietly a few feet away. I didn't mean to scare you. You didn't scare me, just startled me, I stated, walking around him as I headed towards the couch. He followed and sat as well. You shouldn't have let Allison buy me all those things, I tried, pulling a pillow into my lap and picking at it. She was having a lot of fun, he grinned. Besides, she liked you and wanted to do something nice for you. I shrugged. Well, she could have just picked me up a t-shirt then, not an entire wardrobe. Jonathan chuckled. Should I have it sent back? As tempting as that was, I shook my head. No, that would hurt her feelings. There was a moment of awkward silence, and I went to speak, having no idea what I was going to say, but he beat me to it. I've ordered you a new phone. It'll be here tomorrow. I bit my lower lip and nodded. Thanks. I like to take care of things. I grinned. So it seems. More silence, and I finally shrugged. Whatever Track said in those texts. Jonathan leaned back in the couch. He is very protective of you. Another understatement, but I wrinkled my nose nervously. Well, I hope he wasn't rude. I watched him shrug and I shook my head, but he winked. I would feel the same way if I were him. I'm glad you have someone like him watching over you when you are there. I'm very safe in Polson, I chuckled, still playing with the stitching on the pillow. I know you're not looking forward to going to Beamer's tomorrow, he stated, and I furrowed my brows, but didn't reply. But I want very much to show it to you. I nodded. Great. I was hoping he was going to let me out of this. It's one of my favorite clubs, and I'm making it my personal duty to ensure you have a great time. Because my father wants us to become a couple, I wanted to say. Because he's the second highest vampire and you want on the council probably more than you want anything else. But I just smiled. I'm sure it will be fun. He laughed and sat up, looking over at me. Reina, I know the vampire world that you have lived in has been very sheltered and hasn't afforded you much enjoyment, but I intend to change that. I want you to see what this half of your life can be like. I chewed through his words and he continued, Your father is an amazing man, and I can tell you love him dearly. I also know that his work keeps him very busy. You are subjected to top-of-the-line security that follows you wherever you go. You've spent most of your time locked up here in the manor. That is no life for a young vampire. My father is wonderful to me, I stated, though I couldn't seem to put the defense into my words that I wanted to. That is very plain to see, he smiled. But you have no friends here, no one to drag you out of your rooms. You have this notion that the world of vampires is a cold and calculated place, but it's who you are. I worry that you'll start to resent your own kind in search of others, simply because of your hunger for excitement. Where exactly are you going with this? I snapped, finally finding the attitude I was looking for a moment ago. I simply want to show you that you can enjoy being a vampire just as much as you enjoy being a werewolf. I stood and tossed the pillow back on the couch. Well then, you have your work cut out for you. He got up as well. I had a feeling you were going to say that. That amazing smile crossed his face and his eyes sparkled. Like I said, I like taking care of things. I lifted my gaze and looked at him hard. I could guess what his motives were. That was too easy. But why did he have to be so incredibly good-looking? And how did he know me so well? We both turned as Michael cleared his throat in the hallway. My father walked in then, chuckling and making some comment to my bodyguard. I stepped up to him quickly, glad for the distraction. But I stopped short, just in front of him, looking at his face. What was left of my defenses failed. I knew that look too well. I frowned and he sighed and took my hands. I am so sorry, sweetheart. How long? I asked dryly, and he shrugged. Only a few days, a week at the most. I felt like a small child about to throw a fit, but I couldn't help it. I hated it when he left. This place was so empty as it was, and he was my only source of happiness in this large tomb. What about the guests? I asked, grasping at straws. He gestured past me. Jonathan will see to them in my absence. Jonathan, I stated, unable to hide my surprise. Don't get me wrong. I was glad I wasn't going to have to deal with the minor council members myself. But Jonathan? There are some matters that still need to be seen to, and he is more than capable, sweetheart. I nodded, looking down at my shoes. My father lifted my chin and smiled. You still have your outing tomorrow to look forward to. Beamers. He nodded. That should keep you busy for one night. Reina, I can't have you over in Polson when I'm not here, he stated carefully. Oh, I see. I could go with strange vampires that I barely knew into the city and spend the night in a large room full of them, but I couldn't be with my own pack? My face tightened and my father hugged me to him. I'm sorry. You know they are always more than welcome here any time. Maybe I should skip Beamer's then until you get back, I tried, keeping every bit of sarcasm out of my voice. No, I trust that the security measures are in order, and I know you're all looking forward to it. Okay, I was really starting to get confused now. I know my father liked the wolves. He enjoyed track. He had never gone completely out of his way to become friends with them, but he was never rude and helped them in any way he could. I didn't like the vast division in my life or of my loyalties and affections. It hurt, and it was hard. But, like a good daughter, I simply nodded. Why didn't I have more backbone when it came to this? I knew why. My father worked very hard. I knew there were weeks where he didn't sleep at all. He raised me without a mother and never once complained about the sacrifices he had to make when I was younger. He made sure I had everything I needed and always found time for me. It wasn't as much as I would like, but I knew it was more than he really had. He was a great dad, busy and secretive with what went on behind closed doors, but I loved him dearly and I wouldn't complain. Too much. My father smiled over at Jonathan. It will be your job to keep her safe while I'm gone. My head shot up, but my father's eyes were twinkling. She does seem to have quite a knack for getting into trouble, even without trying. Jonathan smiled, but was smart and changed the subject. I'll see that the issues of the councils are taken care of as we discussed. Good, he chuckled, and then smiled at me. Now, why don't we go play a game or two of air hockey, so I can allow my daughter to take her vengeance out on her father in a safe way? That put the smile back on my face. I loved playing air hockey with my dad. He took my hand and we all headed down towards the game room. I did wonder where Allison was, but that was quickly forgotten as we walked in. This game was a bit more interesting if you were a vampire. Our reflexes were lightning fast and our eyes could watch the puck easily. So this table was modified. Instead of one slot in front of each of us, there were four, each one only slightly wider than the puck itself. The paddles were also made out of a nearly unbreakable plastic, and when we really wanted a challenge, we turned off the lights and used our night sight as our only visual sense. A few minutes into the first game, I was laughing and joking with my dad. Jonathan watched and picked up the conversation, keeping it far from anything that would pull my mood away. Of course, I won the first game. Then my dad handed Jonathan his paddle. I was worried that meant he was going to leave, but he stood by as I pummeled his prodigy. I laughed as the puck went flying off the table and made a dent in the wall. "Sorry about that," Jonathan choked, and I shrugged. "I put plenty of holes in these walls, and so has my dad." He quickly retrieved the disc, and I beat him as well. We played for over an hour, and the smile couldn't leave my face. Finally, I watched the two of them face off, and I'm positive Jonathan let my dad win. When my father sat the puck on the table, I knew the end of game time was here, but I was okay with that. I had a great time, and I knew my father, once again, probably had to rearrange things to do this with me before he left. I hugged him tightly, and he kissed my forehead. "I'm going to have to borrow Jonathan for a few minutes," he stated, as the lights came back on. I shrugged, and my father winked. "It's still early. I won't keep him long." Glancing at the clock, I shrugged. "It's 3 o'clock, Dad. I'm going to bed in a few hours." He went to reply, but I turned. "Where's Allison anyway? I haven't seen her since I got back." Both men knew I really didn't care where she was, but Jonathan looked at me. "I'll have her meet you here if you'd like." "No, that's okay. I think I'll just go watch some TV." He nodded, and I got another tight hug from my dad, a lecture about having fun and keeping out of trouble at the same time, and then they left. I watched my dad go, feeling like I was being left in a hole. Jonathan was right about being sheltered. My father kept his business far from me. Aside from the bodyguards, the tight security, and the lack of freedom to come and go as I please, I had no idea what really went on in my father's business affairs. I didn't mind, though. It didn't really interest me. When I reached the hallway, I smiled at Michael and Ander. "I think I'll head to the kitchen for a while. You guys can knock off early." I bit my lip as they turned and followed me. It never worked, but sometimes it was fun to say it out loud. They sat at the small table in the kitchen, and I pulled out a small laptop and went to a website that I liked to search for new recipes. Some of them even had short videos to explain the process. Track wasn't a picky eater, by any sense of the word, but I liked to find things that he might like. After searching for several minutes, I smiled and then headed to the pantry for ingredients. I clicked on my music and even sang quietly while I put the ingredients together. The first egg I tried to crack ended up mush in my hands. I took another one out, put my tongue between my teeth as I concentrated on being as gentle as I could. I growled and threw that one in the garbage as well. 4 eggs later, I finally got the yolk and whites to plop into the bowl, and I cheered quietly for my accomplishment, even doing a little victory dance. "Flour," I stated, reading the page, and moved to the counter, picking up a large canister. I flipped the lock that kept it airtight and batted away the cloud of white powder that popped in my face. "What they see in this stuff," I mumbled, and sat it down and dug out my measuring cups. When I had all the needed ingredients in the bowl, I grabbed a spoon and started mixing. I picked up the bowl, tucked it under one arm, and sang a bit to one of my favorite songs. When I sat it down, I looked back at the screen and frowned. "Preheat. I always forget that part," I mumbled as I went and turned the oven on. I globbed the dough onto the cookie sheet, bobbing my head to the music. Track loved cookies, and I think I was getting the hang of baking them, minus the egg cracking part. I glanced at the light on the oven and shrugged. I knew better than to stray from the instructions. My previous attempts had proven that recipes had rules for a good reason. I washed my hands and leaned over my computer, passing the time looking at other recipes that were still too far out of my league. Finally, the light went out and I popped the sheet in the oven and set the timer. I looked down at myself and sighed, seeing a thin coating of flour mixed with mangled eggs in some places. Oh well, I'd just take another shower before bed. Just as I pulled the first batch out, Jonathan walked in. I frowned, setting the pan down on the burners of the stove. He walked over, looked at the cookies, and then at me. I like to cook to pass the time, I stated with a shrug. His gray eyes twinkled. You realize how ironic that is, right? Yes, but it's not like I eat them or just throw them out. I straightened my shoulders. They're for track. Ah, well, he's a very lucky werewolf to have a friend like you. Why was I getting agitated? I shrugged. He does nice things for me all the time. I went to a drawer and pulled out a spatula, then scooped the cookies onto a plate. Jonathan watched as I filled the sheet with a new batch of dough and then put it in the oven. So is my father gone? I finally asked. He only nodded. Great. Now I was stuck. I couldn't say I had something to do and leave. The cookies were in the oven. Jonathan glanced at my laptop and I followed his look. Okay, so maybe this was a bit strange. A vampire in the kitchen, making cookies and looking up recipes. A series of beeps came from him and he pulled out his fancy phone. I quickly turned and started to clean up the mess I had made. His conversation was short and he smiled at me. So, what exactly don't you like about me? The question completely threw me and I turned too quickly, knocking the container of flour over. He leaned forward and grabbed it quickly, but not before we were both covered in a good amount of it. Sorry about that, I whispered, getting a towel and handing it to him. I was already covered in random food items, so a little bit more didn't matter on me. He took the dry towel and batted at his clothes, which only made the flour take to the air and created a small cloud around us. I had to smile. I don't dislike you very much, I stated under my breath as I closed the container and put it on the other counter. Well, I'm glad for that, he chuckled sarcastically. I'm not very good with people I don't know, I tried. He nodded. I can tell, but I don't think that's the only reason you seem to be avoiding me. I frowned and he stepped up. It's no secret that our fathers would love to have us get together. He started and I took a step back. I have to admit that I wouldn't mind it either, he added, smiling at me. But Reina, you aren't even giving me a chance. You disliked me from the moment I showed up, without knowing anything about me. His voice was calm and his eyes were locked on mine. He wasn't whining. He wasn't angry. He was just simply pointing out the obvious. My father has this thing, I stuttered, leaning back against the counter and crossing my arms. He thinks I need a guy in my life, and he wants to make sure that they are a very particular type of guy. Can you blame him? For which part? I snapped. For either, he nodded. You're his daughter. What father doesn't want the very same thing? Well, yes, but how many daughters have to live in a tomb and have bodyguards follow them everywhere? I shrugged an apology at Michael and Ander, who didn't turn. But you're not the average daughter, he smiled. Just like your father is not the average vampire. He's an extremely important man in our world and others. I spend most of my time out there, he stated, gesturing towards the window with his chin. I know what it's like, the good parts as well as the bad parts. He shook his head, but kept a grin. There isn't a vampire with a son that wouldn't love to see him with you. For my father's power, I mumbled. He nodded. Mostly. Jonathan shrugged when I balked. That's what most of them are after, the fame, the fortune, and the title that would come from being with you, the only daughter and heir of Thomas Beldren. I turned and looked at the timer. This time he sighed, and I turned back to him. I feel like an enemy in your eyes, Reina. Those gray eyes mirrored the hurt in his words, and I bit my lip. As much as I wished he would go away, I didn't take any pleasure in putting that look on his gorgeous face. He kept his eyes on me as he leaned a bit closer. I want to ask for a chance for you to get to know me, but that sounds so canned. My forehead wrinkled as he looked around the room. I shifted my feet a bit and stood in the awkward silence, not sure how to react. Finally he nodded. I'm not such a bad guy, you know, he chuckled without a smile. Right now, solitude in a tomb was looking pretty good. What was I supposed to say to something like that? He watched, his eyes serious and soft. I don't need or want your money. I do pretty well on my own. My eyes widened a bit, but I still couldn't think of a single thing to say. As for your father's title, that's his. I want to be on the High Blood Council. I won't lie about that. But I'm not here thinking that I could use you to get there. I would rather get that position on my own. Then why are you here? Finally, I thought of something to say. I came here because my father wanted me to come. Now we both know my father's intentions are a bit less noble, he chuckled. Well intended, but obvious. He nodded to himself and then straightened his broad shoulders. But I came here for 2 reasons. One was to be able to spend more time with your father. He's an amazing man, and I want to learn from him. And the second? I squeaked out, feeling like one of those humans in the movies I had watched. Was to meet you, he smiled, and his eyes watched my face. There's very little actually known about you, Reina. Your father does a very good job of keeping you out of the spotlight, but the rumors swim like mad fish. I wanted to see how much of those wild tales were true. What tales? I asked, a bit worried now. I had never really given much thought to what was said about me. He laughed, crossing his arms, and shrugged. Let's see. Some have you a mean, wild spinster that had to be locked up to keep you safe. When I balked, he nodded. Others say you are so beautiful that your father has had to lock you away to keep males from all races from trying to steal you away in the night. Then, some just think that he refuses to let you out because he doesn't want to lose you. Well, if I had to pick between those, I liked the last one. Jonathan turned as the timer went off. I walked to the oven, still watching him. What else do they say about me? I had to admit, I was amazed that my life was so intriguing to, anyone. If they knew the real truth, they would yawn and move on to the next hot gossip. The 3 I mentioned are the extremes. There's a bit of everything in between. You're quite the unseen celebrity in our world. I frowned as I reached in and grabbed the cookie sheet, then cried out and instinctively flung the metal pan, cookies and all, as the pain seared through my hand. The cookie sheet slammed into the wall, buckled on impact, and bounced several times before skidding to a halt on the tile. The cookies, still being hot, stuck to various walls and cupboard doors. Crap, I forgot the oven mitt. Andrew and Michael were there in a blink, and Jonathan grabbed my hand and looked at it. The skin was bright red, and the blisters were already forming. He walked me to the sink, turned on the cold water, and held my hand under it. I looked around at the cookies that were now slithering down the surfaces, and I winced from the pain. Man, that hurt. Andrew bent down and picked up the pulverized cookie pan, while Michael stood over me at the sink. The pain was already easing to a throb. Vampires heal quickly, but yikes, that hurt. Unlike some stories, we didn't heal instantly, but my hand would be better by tomorrow and completely healed the day after. Michael pulled my hand out of the cold water and inspected it. "I'm fine," I whispered, embarrassed. He nodded and pushed it back under the water. "I shouldn't have told you all that," Jonathan stated, watching the water coat my blistered hand. "Why not?" I chuckled. "You're the first person that has." He looked up at me and I nodded. "My dad never tells me those things, and, well, the wolves don't know much about what the vampire world thinks about me." His brows rose slightly. "You aren't mad at me?" I laughed and leaned forward, bumping him with my shoulder, which left a smear of flour on his expensive sleeve. "No, I'm not mad, but I am ticked at myself." I watched Ander throw the pan in the garbage. "How about I help you make more?" he offered. "You want to help me make cookies?" I stated, not able to hide my shock. "I'm intrigued, and I would like to see what you enjoy about it. I have a kitchen at my place, and have actually made a few things myself. Never cookies, but—" "Unless your hand—" "No, it's fine," I shot out too quickly, then grabbed a towel and patted it dry, trying not to wince. No one ever wanted to help me cook. Well, except Track, and he was busy. Jonathan took another towel, soaked it in cold water, and wrung it out, then wrapped it gently around my hand. Then I showed him my laptop and explained how the recipes work. He didn't make sarcastic comments and even asked questions. It was nice to know more about something than someone else for once. He finally decided on the same cookie recipe I had just spackled the walls with. We had everything in the bowl except one item. "You have to be very, very careful," I said, as I placed a raw egg in his palm. He nodded and smashed it against the side of the bowl. We laughed as we both picked the pieces of shell out of the batter and quickly decided to use a separate bowl for the next attempts. We were laughing hard by the time I had to pull out another carton, since we kept destroying them. Okay, he smiled, flicking his floured sleeves. "Silence, please. Must concentrate." I giggled into my powdery hand and watched. He held the white oval over the side of the bowl, and I tried to keep as still as possible. Vampires were strong, so doing something that required such delicate force was a bit of a challenge. He raised the egg up an inch and then tapped it against the rim of the bowl. This time the egg cracked down the middle and the contents plopped nicely into the container. He slammed the shells in the garbage and threw his arms up in the air as if he had just won a great victory. I guess he had. He puffed out his chest and I had to laugh. And that's where I'm going to end that.